I'm Norm Letalik, and I'm a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais in Toronto. And Meinhard Doel kindly asked me to give a presentation on an area of law during the course of the last 40 years that I've had some connection with, and also to make a few comments about my connection with the Marine and Environmental Law program. I'm one of the first products of that Marine and Environmental Law program, so I hope that Meinhard will forgive me if I probably don't exactly stick to his guidelines of 25 minutes of presentation and 5 minutes of intro and what my connection is with the Marine Environmental Law program. Sort of the older I get, the more I've learned that a very important rule, which is if you really want to do something, just do it and ask forgiveness rather than asking permission at the beginning. So Meinhard, hopefully you'll be okay with this presentation. We all know that we're here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Marine Environmental Law program at Dalhousie. And I arrived at Dalhousie in the fall of 1977. I had done my first year of law at McGill and realized I had made a horrendous mistake by not coming to Dalhousie. And so I showed up as a transfer student for my second year of law. There were two other transfer students that year, one of whom became my roommate and lifelong friend, Ted McDorman, who you know as Professor Ted McDorman from the University of Victoria Law School. And the other one was Mike McDonald, who then subsequently became the Chief Justice of Nova Scotia. So there were only three of us transfers, but I think it was Les O'Brien that year at the law school who was the associate dean and decided who the laterals were going to be, and I think he made some pretty good choices. In any event, when I arrived at Dalhousie, the Marine Environmental Law program, as it was at that time, was located on Henry Street in a building that doesn't exist anymore. It was directly behind the law school. And Doug Johnson and Edgar Gold had their offices over there. I went over there to introduce myself to them, and I can remember the very first time I walked into Doug's office, I noticed he had a picture up on the wall of himself placing with Pierre Trudeau a wreath at the tomb of Norman Bethune in China. Norman Bethune, as you may know, is a Canadian doctor who was with Mao Zedong during the Long March and is considered a real hero in China. And when Pierre Trudeau opened up China, Doug Johnston was one of the people that went over with him. Doug, earlier in his career, had been one of the most prominent North American-based Chinese law scholars. And that was just a little bit of a reminder of that period, and in fact was in some ways a bit of foreshadowing of what Doug would wind up doing later on in his career. Edgar I got along with extremely well. Edgar's ethnically German. He was born in Germany, was a Holocaust survivor, wound up growing up in Australia, running away to go to sea at the age of 15 and became, I think, the youngest master mariner in the history of the Australian Merchant Marine. He showed up in Halifax many years later as a sea captain, met Judy Gold, who became his wife, and to my wife and I became a wonderful friend. And Edgar and I had sort of that German connection in common. I'm both German as well as Canadian. And we hit it off extremely well. Doug Johnston was a sort of a master theoretician. He had been educated at Yale, where he got his doctorate in law. And he was a disciple of Myers McDougall and Harold Laswell. And that's where he essentially got his Marine connection. He worked with them when he did sort of the leading study in international law on the law of fisheries. And Doug was a very expansive thinker because of, I think, that discipline that he had learned at Yale. And as a result of that, he tended to look at things from many, many different perspectives. He always looked at things from a historical perspective, policy from many different areas, political issues, environmental issues, business issues. He was sort of the quintessential thinker from a multidisciplinary perspective. Shortly after I got to know Edgar and Doug, I learned about an exciting event that was going to happen. It looked virtually certain that SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, was going to fund an innovative program called DOSP, the Dalhousie Ocean Studies Program, where Dalhousie was going to be a center to look at ocean law, policy, and management. And that really came from this, shall I call it, wonderful period at Dal that was occurring in the late 1970s, even a few years before my arrival. Doug had come to Dalhousie because he had long collaborated with Ron MacDonald when Ron MacDonald was dean at the University of Toronto Law School, which is where Doug had taught. And when Ron MacDonald came to Dalhousie to become dean there, shortly he brought Doug with him. Hugh Kindred was already there, a very strong academic in international law. And Edgar Gold had just recently finished law school a few years earlier, and because of his special expertise as a former supertanker captain, had been heavily involved in the investigation of the horrible oil pollution incident that had occurred off the Nova Scotia coast by Chedabucto Bay when the tanker Arrow ran aground at Cerberus Rock, spilled I think it was roughly 10,000 metric tons of oil that blanketed 70 miles of shoreline. To visualize 10,000 tons of oil, that's about 10 million liters of oil that spilled. So Edgar had just finished law school himself, was starting to do more graduate work in that area, had been hired by the faculty a few years earlier. Hugh, as I said, was there already. Ron MacDonald, in many ways, was the dean of the international legal community in Canada at that time. He and his friend Donna Ferrand, a few years earlier, had started the Canadian Council on International Law, which was an association of everybody in Canada, mostly academics, but also people at what was called external affairs in those days, who were interested in international law. And Ron was one of those guys who was a super mentor. He was the ultimate networker, knew everybody, and did everything that he could to help promote people's careers. I think that may have been because Ron never had kids of his own, and he lived with his sister, who was also a very prominent academic, Mari. And they kind of saw all the young people that they encountered as people that they could mentor. Edgar and Judy, in many ways, were similar. They did not have kids, and they were very, very strong mentors for all the young people that they encountered. So when I arrived there, Dal Law was very much in an expansive mode. There was this promise of this new funding, and in fact, the funding did arrive the following year. And so Dal got, at that point, the largest law research fund grant that had ever been given by SSHRC. It was $1.5 million. And for you to understand what $1.5 million meant back then, my starting salary as a full-time law professor at Dal in 1980 was $35,000. So $1.5 million went a long way back in those days. So it was a time of a lot of exciting things happening. In addition to what was happening at the law school, the two other main investigators, in addition to Doug and Edgar for the Dalhousie Ocean Studies program, were Graham Day, who was still just Graham back in those days. That was before he was knighted by Maggie Thatcher to become Sir Graham Day, and Art Hansen. Just to give you a sense of these folks, Graham, at that point, he was a Dal Law graduate, practiced law for a bit in the little town of Windsor, Nova Scotia, worked for Canadian Pacific, then went over to the UK to run Camel Laird shipyards, had done a great job, came back to Canada and got hired by the business faculty at Dal a couple of years earlier. That was still back in the days when Henry Hicks was running Dal, and Henry Hicks was a person of vision who didn't much care about budgets. He just wanted to bring the best and brightest in, and Dal was very lucky, and Ron McDonald was very lucky because they had very good budgets to bring in strong people like Graham and the business faculty, and then Art Hansen, who had arrived, I think, at roughly about 1978 to run the School for Resource and Environmental Studies. At that point, Art had already been a very prominent professor and had done a tremendous amount of work for the Ford Foundation in many parts of the world, particularly in Indonesia, where he was starting to get into concepts like development that had to be sustainable. How could you promote development in a developing country and do it in a way so that the way in which those countries were going to develop and, in some instances, industrialize could be done in an environmentally sustainable way. So there you had the makings of this, very, very multidisciplinary group. Doug, the international legal theoretician, Edgar Gold, the practical, in some ways tough-minded former sea captain who saw what was happening on the ground. Art Hansen, who had a wealth of experience globally in environmental law and sustainable development, and Graham Day, who was already at that stage pretty well a captain of industry with wonderful connections in Ottawa. It was such an exciting time to be there. Ted and I were delighted to have landed at Dalhousie at that time and to be embraced by this. To talk about the Marine Environmental Law program, I ate the full meal. I really got the full meal deal there. In my second year, I took international law, I took law of the sea, I took everything that was offered. There was a law of the sea seminar, Hugh Kindred's carriage of goods by sea course, Edgar's admiralty course, and then the following year there were other programs that I took from the Marine Environmental Law program that really gave me probably as good a background that anybody could have gotten at that point anywhere in the world in international law, marine law, and law of the sea. And in my second year, after I'd spent a summer as a student research assistant, primarily for Edgar, but also doing a few things for Doug, they asked me if I wanted to stick around. They thought that I'd be a great candidate for a Killam Fellowship to do an LLM and to be involved with them and this new Dalhousie Ocean Studies program. Doug's phrase was, join international law and see the world, and that made a lot of sense to me. I'd always enjoyed traveling, loved international law. My previous background had been in international relations and international law. So this just looked like a wonderful opportunity. And so that year, while I was doing my LLM, I was the first employee of the Dalhousie Ocean Studies program as a student research assistant. So I actually had two full-time jobs. I was doing that. And then mostly between midnight and 3 a.m., I was a bit of a night owl then before kids. Between midnight and 3 a.m. is when I wrote most of my master's thesis. When I finished the master's thesis, I was then hired. At that point, Ron McDonald had stepped down as dean, and Bill Charles, who was a very strong supporter of the Marine Environmental Law program, hired me then as a full-time prof. I had already had some experience in teaching the Admiralty course of the fall of 1979. So this was a wonderful place to land. After I got hired on full-time, I then became a research assistant, and then a year later I became the assistant director of the Dalhousie Ocean Studies program. And it was such a wonderful, exciting place to be at that time. I can remember at one point, probably it was 82, 83, the folks, Rob Pritchard, who I'm trying to remember whether he was the dean at the U of T Law School then or whether he was the associate dean, came over to do a lecture on this interesting new and what they thought was really quite advanced concept of law and economics. And wasn't this an interesting lens to look at law through? And Pritchard's a very good presenter. Some of you may know he subsequently became the law dean, then the president of the University of Toronto, and then president of Torstar. Very accomplished on his feet, and he did a great job. But I can remember thinking at it, about his presentation, said, yeah, that's very good, but he's only looking at things from one perspective. Here at DOSP, we're looking at things from so many different perspectives. Economics is part of it, but then the business end is part of it, the environmental end of it is part of it, and that kind of rich soup that existed where we could borrow ideas from one another. Was something that it was magical, I guess, is the only way to really put it. There were other things that helped us at that time. Elizabeth Borghese had shown up first as a Killam Fellow in 1979 and then got hired by the political science department. So we now had our fingers, as it were, into the School for Resource and Environmental Studies, the strong base at the law school, the business school through Graham Day and Professor Mary Brooks and Don Patton, who was, I believe, the dean at that time. It was just a very, very rich environment. Through Art Hansen and the folks at the Marine Environmental Law Institute, they connected us with a number of the top people in Dal's world-class marine biology programs, their oceanography programs, and of course the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. So it was just this wonderful multidisciplinary way of looking at big ideas, big concepts in ocean law and policy. And it was a tremendous time to be there. Lots of young academics. I've already mentioned Ted. First year I was teaching full-time. Phil Saunders was in my small groups contracts class. I saw how bright and clever Phil was and hired him as a summer student. You all know he went on to become dean of Dalhousie Law School. A year behind me was Don Russell, who then subsequently became dean and is a member of the Marine Environmental Law program. There were, others, and it was just a tremendous time with lots of people. In particular, I want to mention Peter Underwood. Peter unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, very prematurely. His background had been oceanography. He had studied at SUNY down in the New York area. And he came up, and he had lots of very interesting and practical experience. He had been an observer on board foreign trawlers off the coast of Nova Scotia and eastern Canada generally, making sure that their catches were within the appropriate limits. And Peter was an extraordinarily bright guy, and he was also a masterful musician, which meant everywhere Peter was, a lot of fun ensued because he could pick up anything and play it. His dad had been a prof in the music school at Dalhousie. And he had a very strong connection with folks on the ground. He could talk to anybody, whether it was the most distinguished professor or the gruffest fishermen. Peter had a way of connecting with them, and lo and behold, Peter went into government in Nova Scotia and became a deputy minister in a number of different areas. So he added a lot. And then the graduate program started bringing in all sorts of other people. Ted McDorman wound up getting his LLM. Same year as David Vanderswag, all people that you know. Dave has a Canada chair at Dalhousie Law, and it was just this wonderful confluence of all of these incredibly creative people across all of these areas. It was a wonderful time to be there. That period sort of continued. I wound up leaving Dalhousie in 1986, mostly because of a project that we had in Southeast Asia, the CPOL project, where we were looking at ocean resource management issues in the South China Sea. The Law of the Sea Convention had been concluded in 1982, and there was a fear that, with states now getting control of an additional 1/3 of the globe's surface, that a lot of dissension might be created as people went out for that land grab and tried to figure out what areas of the ocean were going to be under their control. We were concerned that things would get choked with boundary delimitation issues, and we saw the South China Sea as being an ideal place to see whether there could be cooperation between governments to manage a resource without having to divide it up, because after all, pollution doesn't respect ocean boundaries. Fish don't respect ocean boundaries, and to a degree even oil and gas doesn't respect it in the sense that oil fields cross over boundaries, and depending on who's sucking harder, so to speak, conflicts can develop. Back in those days, when CPOL started, we were communicating with academics and government officials in all of the ASEAN countries, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And so we had collaborated with a number of academics, got government officials involved. But back in those days, believe it or not, the internet didn't exist. In fact, very few people even had faxes. So it was very hard to run a program from 12 time zones away. And I had, through my travels through the CPOL project through Southeast Asia, where in fact Doug was right, I did see that part of the world. I saw a lot of the world during the course of my 6 years with the Dalhousie Ocean Studies program and the law school. And we realized that sort of a good place to sort of set up a base would be jointly in Thailand and in Singapore. So I traveled to Singapore for a couple of years and ran the CPOL project, or my component of it, from Southeast Asia. And at that point, Doug had already left, although he continued to be part of the Marine Environmental Law program. He had moved to the University of Victoria, where he was running their Asia Pacific program. China was really beginning to emerge in the early 1980s. When Ron McDonald finished as a dean, he went over to China to become one of the first Western professors to teach international law. And you have to appreciate what China was like. They had just gone through the Cultural Revolution, where essentially most professors had been re-educated. In some instances that meant death, in other instances that meant hard labor somewhere. And so they really did not have much of an infrastructure. Ron went there during that interesting and turbulent time and got to meet Wang Tiya, who was the leading international law scholar at the University of Beijing, and then brought back with him a group of young Chinese law professors who came to Dalhousie to be educated in international law. Around that time as well, Art Hansen got a program going where we were helping a number of young Indonesian professors learn environmental law so that environmental development could occur. So we were developing very strong Asian ties at that moment. And it's something that harkened back to Doug's earlier career, where he had been one of the top Chinese law scholars. And when University of Victoria set up this Asia Pacific Institute, Doug went over there, and Ted McNorman followed him a year later. We didn't, in some ways, we didn't see that as a real departure from Doug's perspective, because Doug kept his ties with Dalhousie and came back frequently. And Victoria Law School, where Doug landed, back in those days was still known as Dal West. Some of you may not know that University of Victoria Law School was started by 3 Dal Law professors in 1975. Murray Fraser, who had been an associate dean at Dal Law School, who was joined by Bill Charles and Innes Christie. Bill Charles and Innes came back, and Murray Fraser stayed on as the first dean of UVic Law School. So there were already very strong ties to Dal, and so in some ways we didn't see Doug as leaving Dal. We just saw him as being borrowed by Dal West for a few years. Graham Day left. He got sent back into business. There was a lot of activity taking place up in the Arctic. At that time, Dome Petroleum was interested in exploiting oil and gas resources off the coast, and that was something that was happening very much in the early 1980s, in addition to Dome looking at things up in the Beaufort Sea. A lot of oil and gas activity was taking place off the east coast of Canada, particularly in the Hibernia oil field in the early 1980s, and that then caused us to bring yet even more riches to Dal Law School in the form of Ian Townsend Galt, who then came to Dalhousie to start oil and gas law programs together with some of the downtowners that also assisted, like Van Pennick and from McInnes Cooper. So that then added this whole mix of now looking at oil and gas regulatory things. Graham was asked by Smiling Jack Gallagher, the then head of Dome Petroleum, to run the Davie shipyards to help build some structures that could be used for oil and gas development in the Beaufort Sea. He stayed for a short while, and then Maggie Thatcher asked him to go back to England, and as they say, the rest is history. First to run British Shipbuilders, then to run the Austin Rover Group, and then later become chairman of Cadbury Schweppes, etc., and for his very many services to the British government was knighted by Maggie Thatcher. Graham also had the Order of Canada. Edgar Gold, by the way, also got the Order of Canada for his many contributions to the marine environmental law sector. He has the equivalent as well from Australia and as well from Germany. his home. Art Hansen also got the Order of Canada later, and Doug, of course, had every imaginable distinction from every major academic organization globally. He was a fellow of just about every impressive educational society that was out there. That's how august that group was, and how fortunate I was to land there. Let me now move a bit more to the task at hand, and that is to talk a little bit something about at least one area that I think I can add something about, and that's the marine and environmental law sector dealing with oil pollution from ships. That was really one of the first things that I got involved in, and was one of Edgar's sort of lifelong activities. And as I had indicated earlier, he had been involved in the inquiry into the tanker Arrow. And that was a time sort of in 1970 where there was a lot of activity taking place on that front. There were many things happening internationally. The Torrey Canyon was a horrible oil spill that had occurred off the coast of England in 1967. That then led to a whole wealth of international conventions, starting in 1969 with the Intervention Convention that allowed coastal states to intervene to protect their coasts when there was oil pollution. The International Convention on Civil Liability and Oil Pollution, and then 1971 the Fund Convention, and then 73 the MARPOL Convention. Those were all the things that we were looking at and thinking about when I was a student at Dal, and then when we were looking at generally the whole prospect of how ships were going to be safer going forward. If we take a look at the list of sort of oil spills and disasters that occurred, there was the Torrey Canyon, as I had mentioned, in '67, that led to a lot of these conventions. Then there was the Ecofist blowout off the coast of Norway in 1977. The Amico Cadiz, which was at that time the largest tanker disaster off the coast of Brittany. In '79, there was the horrible Ixtac blowout, which has been eclipsed by the Deep Horizon blowout of a couple of years ago, but at that time was the largest blowout. The Atlantic Empress, which was a huge disaster in the Caribbean, an area where we did a lot of work and on the marine environmental side during my tenure at Dal, caused massive pollution damage, and one of the best environments in the world off Trinidad and Tobago. The Tobago Cays are traditionally one of the best diving areas in the world and one of the biggest reef areas. And so there was a lot of activity at that time where there were horrible things happening on in the marine pollution front that were occurring. And that was part of what we were looking at the Dalhousie Ocean Studies program. We benefited, I would say, hugely from Edgar's practical experience. One of the things that I learned is international conventions by diplomats are all very well and good, but if you really want something to improve, you need to do it on the operational side. And Edgar knew the operational side very well. And in fact, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the UN agency that deals with marine matters, understood that as well. And they started to do a number of different things that really involved making sure that the quality of training on board ships was better and that the ships themselves were better upfitted. Those are the important things. When I got into practice, one of the things that I saw when I went aboard ships that had been involved in incidents is it's all about training, following proper procedures, things of that nature. And Edgar made a huge contribution by doing a handbook of marine pollution that in very clear steps sort of let out in steps for sea captains what had to be done. And I think that more than anything really helped. Other things that were happening that we were looking at were things like, the oceans in the old days had been essentially a free-for-all. There were rules of the road that ships nominally had to follow, but we were starting to learn from other sectors like air traffic control. So vessel traffic management started to come in. There were a lot more rules and regulations requiring ships to communicate better with one another, to the point where collisions between ships had been virtually eliminated, which is an excellent thing. GPS got better, and so that ships no longer had to rely on old charts. They were now in a situation where they knew literally within a few meters of where they were so that they could avoid shoals. These days, in fact, GPS and automated navigation is so strong and so good that essentially ships sail themselves. And that's a good thing. We all saw graphically what happens when ships take things off of autopilot in the form of the Costa Concordia, where a silly person on the bridge took this cruise ship off of its normal autopilot, wanted to steer it because he wanted to do a sail-by for a girlfriend, grounded the ship and killed many people and caused millions of dollars worth of damage and countless amounts of grief for many families who lost loved ones in it. We're now at a stage where pretty soon I think we're going to see automated ships. And I think there's always going to be some people on board, the watchers, but to a large degree things are going to be monitored. One of the other things that caused marine pollution in the old days was bad weather stresses ships to the max. The Arrow occurred during a time of a bad storm. The Amico Cadiz occurred during bad storm, and equipment on board was put to stress. Well, these days we have telematics. We have sensors now built into so many of our systems so that they can be monitored in real time, even remotely, so that people can start noticing patterns of stress so that they can see where things need to be replaced. All of that is happening in a very real and realistic way. So that really, when you think about it, since the Exxon Valdez, there have been relatively few major incidents where ships have caused problems. We still have had a number of horrible incidents, involving blowouts in many parts of the world, but the record for tankers has been much better. And it's been mostly, I think, because of better equipment, better training, and those operational things that were a hallmark of the kinds of things that Edgar Gold and, of course, many other folks at the International Maritime Organization were very much promoting. And I think personally that that's a very good thing. One of the things that I see in law and practice is that the corporations that I work with now understand that you don't just go to lawyers when a problem has occurred, lawyers as remediators. The role of lawyers increasingly is becoming people that manage risk, that assess problems, and then help to implement policies and procedures to put into place to keep people out of danger. Richard Susskind, who is one of the most interesting theoreticians on where the practice of law is going, has an analogy where he says law historically has been an ambulance service at the bottom of a hill where somebody falls off the top of it, you pick up the broken pieces and take it away and try and patch it back together. Whereas what law should be is erecting fences at the top of the hill to make sure that no one tumbles down. And I see that law is very much going in that direction. That's what I see our clients want. And I think the role that IMO took and that pioneers like Edgar Gold and also I would say Graham Day was very, very strong on this, as was Art Hansen, because Art always saw, you know, it was one thing to implement a law, it was another thing to see what actually happened. And Graham saw the same thing, having run shipyards and run major corporations. You have to operationalize things before they work properly. And that's really the trend, I think, that I've seen over the last 40 years to end this presentation. There were a lot of things that happened, things that needed to be corrected. A lot of important policy things happened, and I was so lucky to be involved in with such a wonderful group of diverse people at that time to think our ways through how to solve all of these from a legal perspective. And then I also saw the beginnings of how to think of how to actually operationalize this so that it becomes a better world. And that was a marvelous period, and hope that the Marine Environmental Law program will be involved in the next 40 years in thinking more about those very important operational issues so that we can all live in the kind of world that not only we want to live in, but that we want our grandchildren to live in. Thanks very much for this opportunity, Meinhard, and I hope I didn't blow the concept too badly. I'll ask for forgiveness now. Thanks very much.